is Christine Olivieri, your paleo practitioner. So on today's video lesson, we're going to talk about nutrition, specifically carbohydrates. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the glycemic index and the glycemic load. Now the glycemic index you can find in your accompanying companion book, and it has categories of carbohydrates: fruits, vegetables, rice and grains, potatoes, cereals, breads, bakery goods, peas and beans. Now all of these categories are carbohydrates. All of these categories turn to sugar. However, if you choose carbohydrates on the glycemic index that rate less than 50 rather than 50 to 100, you will be eating low glycemic index carbohydrates. These are desirable because these do not turn to sugar quickly. Now the glycemic load is based on the amount of the carbohydrate that you consume. When we talk about the glycemic index, it's only carbohydrates. You want to choose foods that rate 50 and less, not 50 to 100. And you want to consume more of the low glycemic foods and very little amounts of the high glycemic foods. Or if you're like me, you won't consume any of the high glycemic foods. Those would be foods like cereals. They always rate higher than 50. Your rice and grains almost always specifically rate more than 50. Breads, crackers, cookies, muffins, pretzels, chips, pasta. Basically all of these are high glycemic foods with a high glycemic load. You really don't want to consume those. So let's also talk about whether or not you really need grains to be healthy, because you don't. So when you watch other video lessons, specifically those on the paleo eating pattern, I want you to pay close attention to why I talk about how grains are so unhealthy. Because to a human being, we're not designed to eat them. They contain things like lectins, which actually reduce the satiety hormones. And let's talk about phytates, which are the anti-nutrients. They actually block the absorption in your GI tract of any of the vitamins or nutrition that you might find in grains. And then there's also gluten, which is pretty much inherent just to wheat, barley, and rye. And those are very inflammatory to humans. We're not designed to eat any gluten at all. Now, the reason why this is all coming to light in the last 10 years or so really is due to the genetic modification of a lot of these high-yield foods. Now, what I mean by a high-yield foods is they make an awful lot of money when they grow grains for us. And they make it relatively cheap, but they charge a lot of money for a box of cereal or for pretzels. So it's a very, very high yield money crop. And that's why they started genetically modifying these foods. Back about 30 years ago, Dr. Borlaug actually won the Nobel Prize for his first genetic modification of wheat. So wheat is generally only grows about 3 feet high. And wheat historically had a very high stalk and a very small head on it. But when Dr. Borlaug, back in the 1970s and 80s, started genetically modifying wheat, he was asked to grow a much larger head on the top of the wheat. Well, the problem with that is that the wheat would fall over from the weight of it, and it was very difficult to harvest and thresh. So the geneticist was asked to grow it on a shorter stalk. No problem. So all the wheat we've been eating in this country for about 30 years now is what we call dwarf wheat, which means it grows about 18 inches high and it has a huge head of wheat on top. That wheat is also much, much higher in sugar content, much lower in fiber content, and much higher in gluten content. And that's why gluten has become a big deal in the last 10 years or so. Because people who never had a gluten intolerance before now do. So what about fiber? Well, vegetables on average have 8 times the fiber of whole wheat bread, and fruit has about twice the fiber of whole wheat bread. Actually, grains are one of the poorest sources of fiber. So therefore, if you're buying any kind of grain product like cereal or breads, you're probably going to see some artificial fibers in there. Things like inulin, maltodextrin, and polydextrose. You really don't want to eat these things. So let's talk about starchy versus non-starchy vegetables. I really would like for you to eat non-starchy vegetables to your heart's content. Eat as many as you want. In the accompanying book, you're going to find a list of non-starchy vegetables like asparagus and beets, bell peppers, broccoli, cucumber, collard greens, cauliflower, kale, mushrooms, the list goes on. Just be careful of eating your starchy vegetables, things like potatoes and legumes, because these are higher on the glycemic index and will raise your blood sugar and insulin levels more. So vegetables contain lots of phytochemicals, which are very healthy, things like carotenoids, flavonoids, indoles, and isoflavones. Now, lycopene is an antioxidant, which reduces oxidation, which is a big factor in the development of AGEs. AGEs are accelerated glycated end products. We can't get away from the development of these. You get more of them as you age, and if you eat foods that are higher on the glycemic index, you will have more development of these. Unfortunately, when you have a lot of these, they will deposit in your body. They'll deposit in your skin, aging your skin. They'll deposit inside the walls of your arteries, causing more inflammation. And they'll also deposit in your joints, causing an acceleration of things like osteoarthritis. A lot of people think that's simply a result of aging. And to some degree it may be. But to the degree we have it in our culture right now, I guarantee it's a far more profound effect of accelerated glycated end products. Now, vegetables are also a great source of vitamin K, which is also known to lower your blood pressure, reduce the risk of kidney stones, and reduce blood loss. Veggies are also a great source of calcium, especially in your cruciferous vegetables. So eat lots and lots of your non-starchy vegetables. That's where you should get the big bulk of your carbohydrates. Let's talk about types of starch. Now, you have three basic types of starch: amylopectin A, B, and C. Amylopectin A is your most readily available and highest glycemic index starch, and that's found in grains. Personally, I think you should avoid them all. Now, the second source of amylopectin is B. That's found in starchy foods like potatoes and bananas. Now, if you eat a banana that's lower in its ripeness, a little bit more on the green side, by the time you digest it, it's going to pretty much not be able to be broken down in your GI tract and absorbed as sugar because it's less ripe. That also causes it to have a lower glycemic index. But when you eat bananas that are very ripe, they're sugar before you even eat them, rather than the amylopectin B starch, and therefore will raise your blood sugar very much. So avoid very ripe bananas. And the last type of starch is amylopectin C, and this is found in beans and legumes. Now, I find beans and legumes to be the least offensive anti-paleo food. So if you're going to have some beans and some legumes, very small quantities, and they do break down lower in the GI tract, which is why they have that notorious side effect of gas production. Now, how many carbs should you eat in a day? Oh my goodness, I can tell you, I've seen some of my patients that eat 200 and 300 grams of carbohydrates in a day. This is most of my overweight patients. They eat way too many, and it will cause weight gain. So how many grams of carbohydrates should you have in a day? Try to keep it to about 100 to 150. Very low carb diets usually are less than 100. And I find that to be very difficult for many people to stick to. I personally do keep my carbs to around 100 to 120 a day. And I don't struggle with that, because if you just avoid the high starchy foods like the grains and the legumes and the potatoes, you really won't have a problem, because you won't be able to eat too many vegetables, because they fill you up with their high fiber content and their very high water content and their very high nutrition content. So I hope that this answers some questions that you may have about carbohydrates. Please watch the next video, which is going to be focused more on proteins and fats. And thank you for letting me be your paleo practitioner.